Well, firstly, welcome, Sarah, to the Housing Collective podcast, and an absolute pleasure to have you here today.
Thank you very much. It's lovely to be with you.
Absolute pleasure. So for the listeners, Sarah, could you give us a brief introduction of yourself and your organisation?
My name is Sarah Jones and I'm the Chief Executive of Anchor. Anchor is the largest operator of social housing for older people and is now the fourth largest residential care home operator in England. And we operate over 35,500 social rented units, over 12,500 home ownership units, and we're now just up to 128 care homes. So within all of that, we support over 65,000 customers. We've got more than 10,500 colleagues in almost 1,700 locations in about 85% of local authority areas. So it's a big organisation, but we do very well at making it feel warm and approachable, and a family kind of approach that we take to it. We have a strategic plan, of course, but we distill it into 4 mores, which is very convenient. More and better homes where people love living in later life, more opportunities for colleagues in career development and reward. We want to be a more influential voice for older people, particularly by sharing our experience with policymakers, and all of that being underpinned by being more efficient. And we challenge ourselves to innovate and do things better. And of course, no large organisation is complete without a set of values that it chooses to live by, but we genuinely do live by our values all the way through the organisation. And they are accountable, respectful, courageous and honest. And I think perhaps there's some quite sort of familiar generic terms in there, but perhaps the courageous and honest are slightly more unusual, and we'll touch on those a bit later.
Yeah, no, sounds fantastic, Sarah. We'll definitely pick that up later on. And in respect to yourself, Sarah, can you share with us a bit about your journey of becoming Chief Executive of Anchor?
Yeah, so I joined Anchor Trust, as it was then, in 2014, and that was my entry into housing and care. So I'm a chartered management accountant, and before I joined Anchor as finance director, I held a number of senior finance roles across large corporate and private equity businesses in retail and wholesale. So very, very different. I became the CFO of Anchor in 2018, and I was appointed as CEO in August of last year.
Fantastic, and congratulations as well. So,
Thank you.
And you mentioned there, and I find this fascinating. So you had a really successful career in the commercial sector with organisations such as Carpet-Rite and Spices, just to name a few large commercial businesses. Talk to us about why you made the move and made the decision to move into housing.
Well, I suppose the stock answer is to give something back, and that always makes me feel slightly anxious when people start using that terminology. It has a few implications for me, and it was actually much more direct than that for me. I absolutely loved my time in retail. I made some amazing friends, and it was a fantastic education working through that. And I have a number of mentors who I continue to lean on very heavily. It was fantastic. But I think after many years in that space, I just found that the thread between who I was privately and who I was in a professional capacity was stretched to a breaking point, really. Right. So I was very good at what I did. Whether it was something that aligned with my values was something slightly different. And I wanted to move into a role in a sector that was more aligned with my values and what I hold to be true and important. And I had the privilege to be able to do that.
Fantastic. And you mentioned that it was the right set of values, but understandably, going from a completely different sector, that they'll no doubt have its challenges when you first moved into it. So what were the key challenges for you personally once you moved to Anchor in the sector?
Yeah, it was really interesting. There are many similarities in culture, actually, and lots of read across from retail into housing and care, which some people might find a bit odd, but genuinely I think it was. But particularly that sense of having to embed a sense of brand and collective endeavour across a very disparate workforce. That's the big thing, and being able to deliver that consistent quality service across a sort of wide geographical area. But of course there were very differences as well, and some of those were quite profound. Yeah. I think some of the differences were very positive and some of them less so. I think I certainly had the advantage of being brought into Anchor by a board who intentionally sought someone from out of sector who could help them deliver on their merger and acquisition strategy and the refinancing and some quite substantial strategic change that they wanted to deliver. So I was brought in with a mandate for change, which was great.
Yeah.
But even within that, there was still some resistance. So I think certainly in the early days, commercial was seen as a pejorative term. That was a black mark if you were commercial. And I think because I was from out of sector commercial background and a finance person, I think I was characterised as being part of the evil empire. When I first arrived, which was pretty funny, and particularly for me because I joined a sector because of my values. I did find that quite challenging, but I found that by sort of building trust with people, especially exploring a lot about what it means to be not for profit. That doesn't mean that you aim not to have any money left over at the end of the year. This concept of actually being about not for distribution rather than not for profit, because everything you're striving to do is just to deliver a surplus that enables you to do more of the good stuff that you want to do. I think there was quite a lot of education around that. I think I was also helped by the fact that although we're a housing association, we're also a very, very large care business, and the cadence of that is different.
Of course.
That does move more quickly, and you do have to be more commercial in air quotes. But bizarrely, and this is going to sound a bit bizarre, I think one of the things that helped me the most was the emergency budget in 2015, because all of a sudden, everything that people thought was a given in the housing sector was suddenly being torn up. And I think that level of disruption enabled me to say, okay, so things aren't always going to be the same.
Yeah.
You meet that resistance, say, well, this is how we do things around here. All of a sudden, that wasn't going to cut it. And so, that was actually quite a help to me at the time that happened.
Brilliant. And you obviously have made a really successful career moving into this sector. I mean, do you have any advice to senior leaders from other sectors looking to move into housing and make the step that you did?
I'll definitely encourage it. And it's happened a lot more in recent years. I think when I made my move, it was still quite unusual. There's been a lot more of it since, and I think that will all help the sector. It will help the sector with its resilience, which is certainly something we need at the moment. At the time I moved, I remember very clearly being told by a recruitment consultant that I had killed my career by making the move into Anchor.
Right.
And that no one, absolutely, it was quite an interesting conversation, and that no one in a for-profit business would ever look at me again. Which was quite an interesting conversation. But as I said, I think it's been good for the sector, and obviously for my personal growth, it's been fantastic. I think the important thing is if someone from a different sector is going to move into this one, make sure you're doing it for the right reasons. So that links back to the comment I made about giving back. Do not come into this sector if you think, great, I've put in a shift in a so-called commercial business. I'm going to come into this sector, feet up on desk. I will give something back. It is not like that. It is hard.
Yeah.
And I think particularly from if you've been in a sector where your sole purpose has been to drive shareholder value or to achieve an exit multiple, and that purity of purpose you have is very, very clear, you come into this sector and it's going to feel much harder. Yeah. So you've got multiple challenges and multiple ambitions, which can often feel like they're coming into conflict. And so make sure you're doing it for the right reasons, not because you think you've earned a bit of a rest.
Yeah. It's great advice. No, brilliant. No, and if only people knew what you guys do. So it's
absolutely.
I completely agree. And Sarah, what I'm really keen to understand as well, because you mentioned at the beginning around your journey, and you were appointed chief executive back in August. Now, your predecessor Jane was with the organisation for more than 20 years. Correct me if I'm wrong. Nearly over 12 years as chief executive as well. So, how have you been able to elevate yourself in your own organisation to become the chief exec while also putting your own stamp on the organisation?
Yeah, I mean, it helped that Jane and I worked together so closely for a number of years, and we worked on strategy together. And as a consequence, I really believed in the mission. So when I was going through the interview process with the board, I did say to them very clearly, this is your chance to break with that strategy. If you want to do something different, then do that. But then I'm not your woman, because I really believe in what we're doing. So that really helped me. I think the biggest challenge I've found in making that transition is that as CEO, you find yourself accountable for everything but responsible for nothing. And that's very different from being a CFO. So with a CFO, the lines are very, very clearly drawn, and you can go and say to someone, do that, don't do that, spend that money, don't spend that money, and it's very, very clear. As a CEO, you don't have that. You have to bring people along with you. And that's quite interesting. I think for me, it's helpful that I was never a typical, or a stereotypical, should I say, a stereotypical CFO.
Yeah.
So I think for me to make that transition was very, very helpful. So I think so believing in that mission, being on a transition with that mission, there's been no immediate changes except probably in some aspects of the tone of voice and how I project myself and the organisation in the outside world and internally actually, because that authenticity is really important to me. I think we'll be making more changes over time, but they'll be about what's best for Anchor and its stakeholders, not about my personal preferences, certainly. But I do reflect on the fact it is quite funny that obviously one of the real strengths of my appointment, I think, was that level of continuity, and everything was supposed to be a seamless transition, which it was from an Anchor point of view, but unfortunately the outside world had a slightly different take on that. So the outside world has been going slightly bonkers. But yeah, Anchor sails on.
It's got that continuity, as you mentioned. And do you have any advice, Sarah, for senior leaders who are looking to take their first chief executive role, but as an internal candidate like yourself?
Yeah, definitely don't overlook the value of your inherent knowledge. That can often be overlooked in a process. I think people overlook it in themselves. We always look to what we can't do, don't we, and criticise ourselves without recognising the strengths that we bring to a process. I think if I can be slightly provocative, I think boards sometimes fall for that as well in a process. That they'll see someone come along and it's all look at the shiny, and they can overlook what's going on internally. So I think to definitely make sure that you understand your own value. Look at potential external candidates and evaluate yourself compared to them. You can often find that you are comparing yourself against something that doesn't exist, this ideal model that nobody would ever match up to. So just understand yourself. And I think without going too far off onto a gender point, I think that's particularly for women who are looking into leadership positions as well. It is a truism that women think they need to tick every box before they can apply for a job. Anyone else who's going to go up for that job against you is not going to be able to tick all those boxes. So completely just bear that in mind. Have the confidence.
That is fantastic advice, and I completely agree with all the points that you've just made. I think it's that the imposter syndrome can creep in so much when actually you sometimes people, particularly with females as well, you don't realize how good you are. And I think so sometimes just go for it. What's the worst that could happen at the end of the day? So, and if we take this conversation into Anchor, and obviously some of the things that you mentioned right at the beginning, Sarah, what are your key priorities for the next 12, 24 months? And also, you've got a new executive team to a certain extent. So how are you holding yourself and your executive to account on the delivery of those priorities?
As I was saying, the biggest advantage that we have is that we've got this very clear strategic plan. And what's been particularly interesting, despite the challenges of the last few years with the pandemic, which obviously as a provider of care and services for older people was particularly profound for us, and then the recent economic turmoil, we have had that clear plan, and actually everything that's happened in the outside world has been a vindication of that. So our direction of travel about making our organisation more resilient and about enabling our colleagues and residents to have greater resilience as well. And I don't mean by that by toughening them up, but basically by creating the conditions in which they can thrive. We're doing that. So it's not about asking them to be tougher and to get on with it. We are creating that environment where for both residents and colleagues to sort of be happy to live and work in our services. So that's really, really helpful. In terms of where we are at the moment, again, because of what's going on in the outside world, a bit from a regulatory point of view, an economic point of view, whichever way you look, I think the balance of operational, tactical and strategic is really important. So probably the best analogy I can draw on that is that it's really important that we're having those big strategic conversations about net zero carbon by 2050. If that stops us from doing the day-to-day stuff of improving residents' daily life by doing the cavity wall insulation, improving their windows, whatever that might be, you know, that is going to be a failing, and you have to balance those things all the time, and that can be a real challenge. I am an empiricist by nature, and so I think for me that how I will hold myself and the leadership team to account, it's about understanding where we are for good or ill and being very honest about that. Set targets and then report performance against those targets. So that sounds pretty straightforward, but you also have to remember that we have to look at things holistically, of course, because we've all, you know, there are a myriad case studies of where very, very specific targets have been set and there have been unintended consequences of those. So again, as I was saying, with an organisation like this, where we're managing multiple stakeholders, multiple aims and ambitions, multiple risks and opportunities, we have to take a holistic view of what we're targeting and how we're measuring it.
And talk about that target. Anchor is, as you rightfully say, the largest provider for older people.
Yeah.
Given the UK's ageing population, what innovative ways are you thinking about how you can support that demographic moving forward?
Well, I could give you, and I will give you a little bit of the stock answer. This stuff is embedded in my brain, as you can imagine. So, our ambition, our ambition is to build Anchor so that we can support our existing customers and the next generation of people in later life, and that means providing older people with the right level of care and support, where and when it's needed, and to offer choice across a range of tenures, level of acuity, all that sort of thing. But I think for me, it's much more fundamental than that. So we are still viewed as specialist housing, and that's within the sector as well as outside the sector. And given that 1 in 4 of us will be over 65 by 2037, how can that be anything other than mainstream?
Yeah.
It has to be, and so there has to be a complete change of point of view. Also, older people are not homogenous either. Newsflash, we have people living who are in housing who are 55 to over 100.
Yeah.
So you wouldn't put a group of people from a newborn baby to the age of 45 into one setting and expect them to behave in the same way and respond to the same things. That's a really important point. Also, we're not operating in a vacuum. There's a housing crisis, so we've got to consider that. So basically, we're looking to provide safe and affordable housing where people can age in place. We want to support the creation of communities. We have to recognise the changing demographic, people working for longer, recognising people are living longer, but not necessarily in best health. And so that idea of wherever you are in an Anchor service, there will be that person-centred approach that will allow people to live the best possible life wherever they are.
Definitely. It's going back to that point that you and I have spoken about over years, is that there is an over 55 strategy. Well, that isn't the case anymore, is it? You've got to think is so different to what you have done in the past. A bit of a controversial statement here, Sarah, but was keen to get your thoughts on it. So what are your views on the opinion that within our sector, that older people can be viewed through the lens of being a drain on resources? So bed blockers, housing blocks, and there is a perception that this demographic can be viewed as the golden generation with final salary pensions. What are your thoughts?
I think that is a real challenge. I mean, unfortunately, so much of sort of public discourse seems to be around sort of pitting one group against another, and that intergenerational thing is a real problem. I think the thing I find particularly challenging is often when I go to seminars or when I'm at forums talking about older people's services or housing, people talk about they want this, they will want that, this kind of othering of anyone who is over 55. And that is really unhelpful because it's all of us, let's hope anyway that all of us will be in that age group. So and nobody is born at the age of 55. Everybody has a history and a hinterland, and they should be valued. And so it comes back to that kind of that person-centered approach. It is not that you get to a certain age and then you get shuffled off. Your value ceases to be true. And I think that so with the pension side of things, it's certainly true for a subset, but that is absolutely not the norm. And I think that the important thing is that housing is so key for all of these issues in terms of addressing all of these issues. So the housing blockers, when people talk about older people blocking family housing, will give older people something that's appropriate and aspirational for them to move into. And by aspirational, I'm not talking high end sort of bells and whistles and all shiny. I mean, just something that is absolutely practical that older people want to move towards rather than away from something else. So the pejorative language that is used is really, really challenging, I think. And so it does come back to this idea of taking an holistic approach.
As with so many other matters, there's an issue in the absence of a holistic approach around health, housing, and other services. So how do Anchor seek to address this, and what advice would you give to leaders facing the same challenge?
It is to take that holistic approach, and it is really difficult at the moment, obviously with the outside world being the way it is, the economy being the way that it is, but we know that housing is at the heart of all of these things. So particularly for age appropriate housing for older people, if you can help people age in place in a community, if someone starts on a dementia journey, that they will enter into residential care if they have to much later, if they've got support of a community around them. Similarly, if they're living in age appropriate housing, they're much less likely to slip, trip or fall. All of that has an empirical, monetizable, demonstrable impact on the public sphere as well. So that the social value that we can generate by creating age appropriate housing and those communities for older people is absolutely demonstrable. So we see that as well with care homes and the role that they have around delayed discharge from hospitals. But joining those aspects up is the real challenge, and that's on our side as a sector. We need to be more joined up with different services and the different organisations that we have as a sector, and also the stakeholders and certainly policymakers. And that comes back to why one of our formals of our strategic plan is to be more influential. And to speak to policymakers, because there is a lot that we could do within the current legislative and economic framework. We're not asking for revolution. We can have all the conversations about planning reform. We can have all of the conversations about social care funding. They will go on and on, I'm sure, for a number of years. But there is a lot that we can do now and make lives a lot better for everybody.
Definitely. And it's quite clear you are incredibly driven and you've got a great aspect of your strategic priorities there. But if we talk about you, what's your why? What's keeping you going?
It's meeting residents and colleagues. So it was really interesting. I've been getting out as much as I can. I don't think there's any substitute for getting out and speaking to residents and colleagues and understanding their experience. And it was interesting. I was chatting with some residents a couple of weeks ago, and they were giving me a justifiably hard time about something. And one of them said, "Oh, I bet you hate this bit of your job." And I said, "Absolutely not. This is the best bit of my job." That is what I love doing. When I go out and I'll see, you know, in a care home, and you'll see a care assistant just offering the most incredible, empathetic care and support to somebody, and then they'll just say, "Oh, that's just my job." When you praise them for it, it's incredible. So it's colleagues and residents. That's my why.
Fantastic. Well, before I let you go, Sarah, we do have some quick fire questions, so no pressure. So what has been your most valuable leadership lesson that you've learned?
Principles. If you have them, stick to them.
Love that. And what advice would you give to an aspiring leader starting out on their journey?
Go for it. Recognise your value and recognise the value that you can bring to others.
And what do you believe to be the key leadership qualities required in today's world?
Authenticity. But someone brilliant introduced me to the concept of radical candor the other day, and I realised that basically that's what I've always done. I didn't realise it had a label.
Brilliant. So there we go. Absolutely fantastic.
Radical
candor. There we go. I'll have to Google that one as well. So it's and just a final question: one book recommendation you'd give to the listeners?
Right. So this is going to feel a bit odd, but I would really recommend The Thursday Murder Club by Richard Osman.
Right. Okay.
Because it is set in a retirement village setting. But that is just the situation. All of the protagonists in that book are older people, but that is absolutely secondary to who they are. There is the former spook who can still has a gun and a whip smart mind. All of those people in it, and the characters that are really brought to the fore in that, and about how their histories and their backgrounds are still so valuable. And I think that was, and it's also a lot of fun as well. But that'd be my recommendation.
Absolutely fantastic. Sarah, thank you so much for joining us on the Housing Collective podcast. It's been an absolute pleasure, and I look forward to seeing you soon.
Thank you.